Hi everyone, my name is Martin. I'm the chapter leader for OWASP Santa Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm going to do a little introduction about the chapter, and then we'll get started with the technical presentation. So here in Santa Barbara, we're all about hands-on training. So we usually do that with the group. We bring in our computer, sit down, and just play with that keyboard and the different applications, get really good trainings from a lot of colleagues and friends. And we also participate from UPSEC California, which for those of you who don't know, it's a really nice conference that's held in every year in January in Santa Monica near Los Angeles. So I invite all of you to come visit us next time. And with that, I'm going to get into the presentation, and I'll be talking a little bit more about the chapter as well during the presentation. Let's see if we can go full screen with the slides. Excellent. So a little bit about me. I'm an application security consultant at a small firm that I started recently called C13 Security. As I mentioned, I'm also the leader for OWASP Santa Barbara, and it's interesting to see how I evolved in the foundation from being an attendee to becoming a lot more involved. I was an attendee for the chapter here in Santa Barbara for a couple of years. And about almost 2 years ago, I became the leader, and so I've been leading the group since then. It's been a great experience. I encourage everyone to get in touch with your local chapters and even with the organization of the chapter. It's a lot easier when you have multiple leaders to organize and hold the meetings. In regards to UPSEC California, the conference I just mentioned, I was an attendee for a couple of years as well. Then I became a volunteer. I'm only volunteering for the conference days for a couple of years. And I finally became part of the organizing committee a couple of years ago when I took over the Santa Barbara chapter. You can see a little bit of my experience there, quite a few years of software development, mostly focused on security projects, some years of application security, and a couple of years of pen testing. I'm a very social person. I love interacting with the community, so don't hesitate to get in touch with me to chat about this presentation, any follow-up questions you may have, or even just chat about security in general. That's my contact information right there. So the agenda for today, we're gonna take a moment of reflection. There's something that I would like to briefly comment on, and then we'll get into the technical presentation about the HTTP security headers. We'll talk about what the headers are, what the specific security headers are, what vulnerabilities they can help prevent, and then we'll do a very brief summary and wrap it up. So before we get into the technical details of this presentation, as I mentioned, I'd like to take a moment to comment on what's going on in the country, which I personally think it's terrible. The amount of anger and violence we've seen in the last week, it's really heartbreaking. I think this is a time for change, and I encourage everyone to be part of it. Go ahead and voice your concerns respectfully. Join march and protests that are also peaceful. And if you care about the subject and you're staying silent, then unfortunately you're being part of the problem, and we may have all been culprits of that in the past. So yeah, this is about basic human rights that we should all have. And I think it's important to make this comment here in this particular conference, because OWASP in particular strives to make the community diverse and inclusive. We put a lot of effort in our chapter, and in particular in the AppSec California conference as well, to make our community and our attendees very diverse, include everyone. We do scholarships for minorities. So it's really a core part of what our organization is. And now it's the time to show it more than ever. Okay, let's get into the technical presentation. So HTTP headers, just a quick overview for those of you not familiar with this concept. The HTTP messages are used to exchange data between clients and servers, web clients and servers. So the headers are used within those messages to pass additional information. And this information is usually metadata, which is data about the data itself, the body of the message. In this context, it's important to keep in mind that when we say a client, we mean a web-compatible client. That is a client that understands HTTP messages and those headers. Examples are browsers such as Chrome or Firefox, but also it can be embedded browsers in native applications. That's very common these days as well. These HTTP messages can be one of two types. It can be a request or a response. So requests are sent from the clients to the server to trigger some kind of action on the server side, and the responses is basically the answer from the server to the client. Examples of different kind of metadata that can be passed in these additional headers can be, for example, the type of data that's being sent, which could be JSON or XML, and the length of that data. As you can see in the slide, the header format is pretty simple. It's just a case-insensitive name followed by a colon and then the value. And there are specific headers available for different purposes. Common examples are headers for authentication, for caching information, or preventing caching. As we will see on the client side, handling cookies, proxy configuration, security, which of course is the focus of this presentation. And some of the headers apply to both HTTP requests and responses, and some of them are restricted to only one of those types. Just a quick overview of a message here. Without too much detail, you basically have a star line at the top that indicates the type of request or the response code. It's followed by the HTTP headers. And then down below, you have the body of the message, which can be an HTML document, XML data, binary data, etc. This is also known as the payload. Let's get into the specific security headers now. So the HTTP security headers are particularly response headers. And again, those are the ones sent from the server back to the client after a request, and are used to enable certain security mechanisms on the client side. These headers are a fundamental part of web security. And that's because they help protect against different types of attacks, such as cross-site scripting, code injections, session hijacking, among many others. They are often misconfigured and sometimes not enabled at all. And it's for me as a consultant, it's interesting to see how often small companies, they rush to implement whatever product they're working on, and they don't find a little bit of time to research about these topics and implement these things, such as the security headers, which, in my personal opinion, are a big win or a big ROI, as it says there, return of investment. And that's because many of them, not all, some of them are definitely complex, but many of them are easy to implement, and they provide another good layer of security. That's why I think it's important to make developers aware of these headers and push for their implementation. Before we go into the detailed headers, let's just look at some URL nomenclature that we're going to be using throughout the presentation. So we have a full URL right there, attacker.io exploit shell, and then the query. The important thing from this slide is the origin. As it's highlighted on this slide, the origin is the protocol, the port, if specified. If not, that's the default one, and the host. So two origins are the same if those three elements match. Origin matches if protocol, port, and host is the same. If any of that is not the same, then it's considered a completely different origin. So the first header we'll look at is cache control. Some people don't see this particular header as a specific security header, falling into that category. I personally do, because handling the cache on the client side, the bad handling of the cache on the client side has led and keeps leading to multiple vulnerabilities in web applications. So the cache control HTTP security header dictates the caching behavior of web clients, but also intermediary proxies. The caching helps optimize performance, but as I mentioned, can also lead to different kinds of vulnerabilities, mostly on the client side. Some examples could be, imagine that a web application caches sensitive information, and that web app is being accessed from a shared system. Now that that cached information could be accessed by reading the browser's cache, right? And sometimes is that that's as easy as clicking back on the browser. An example of a vulnerability, a caching vulnerability on an intermediate proxy can be, let's say you have a proxy that's incorrectly configured and it's exposing sensitive data. And that's happened in the past. And it's important to note that that sensitive data shouldn't have been cached in that in the intermediate proxy in the first place. So the cache control helps prevent sensitive data exposure, which I just mentioned, and also other more advanced attacks such as web cache poisoning. Sensitive data exposure is very common, and it's actually number 3 in the OWASP top 10. Web cache poisoning happens when an attacker sends a request that can cause a harmful response, for example, with an XSS payload, and that gets saved into the cache, and then it gets served to other users. This particular header is commonly seen with the pragma and expires headers. That's mainly done for backwards compatibility. And when cache control is specified, it takes precedence over these other two headers. Some common directives, and I must make clear that while I list these directives for the different headers, I'm not going to be listing all of them. I'm just going to be listing the most common ones for most headers because there's a lot. So I want to focus on the ones that are most relevant in terms of security. So excuse me. Common cache control directives are public, which means the cache can be, any cache can store the information. Private, which means only private cache can store the information. I'm sorry, excuse me. Private means, I think that's wrong right there. It means that only private caches can store the information. That would be the browser's cache. No cache, which is a very confusing one, means that it no cache means that it I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here. Bear with me for a second. Okay, I think I'm back. Sorry about that. I was saying that no cache is confusing, but you would think that it means don't cache anything. But it actually means don't cache, don't use the cache copy if it's not the latest. The one that you want to use when you don't want to cache anything is actually no store. And then you have a max age, which is the time a resource is considered fresh, specified in seconds. The recommended configuration for confidential resources is no store. Again, do not get confused with no cache. You want to use no store along with pragma, no cache. That's interesting there because pragma and control are both used to, and cache control are both used to control the cache. And the way the directives are defined, it makes it obviously very confusing. So you want to use cache control, no store, with pragma, no cache, and expires 0. Again, the last two are used for backwards compatibility only. And if you're only dealing with very with recent versions of browsers, you probably don't even need the last two. Now, there's many resources online that for the cache control directive, they specify like 4 or 5 directives, cache control header, they specify 4 or 5 directives, including no store. That's actually really confusing. It confused me in the beginning quite a bit. Mozilla suggests that to only use the no store directive for the cache control header and not trying to add a bunch of other directives for extra safety, which only adds confusing and are actually not needed. Some real-world examples of cache control vulnerabilities that could have been prevented by using this directive in the right way. And you will see, as I talk through the different examples throughout the presentation, you will see that I added the dates of when these vulnerabilities were discovered, because I think that's relevant to make it clear that the security headers topic, it's even though it's been around for many years, it's still relevant and it's still not well understood and implemented by a lot of people and companies. So first example is same origin policy bypass using the browser cache. So again, two URLs have the same origin if the protocol, port, and host is the same for both. And the same origin policy is the security mechanism that restricts how a document, for example, a script, is loaded from a specific origin can interact with resources from another origin. This is just a mechanism to separate the different origins, the different applications, which really helps isolate potentially malicious resources. So going into the example, a private user information is returned without disabling caching. And even though the application had a mechanism to explicitly disallow cross-origin requests, which was good, an attacker could still make a cross-origin request and retrieve private data from a previous authenticated user by forcing that request to read the information from the cache. So the information was cached, it was sensitive. By forcing a cross-origin request to read that information from the cache, an attacker could still get this sensitive information. I'm going to move along. You guys can check out that other example later because this is a long presentation and we don't have a lot of time. Set cookie. I'm sure you've heard about this header. Again, for some people, it may not be a very specific security header, but since cookies mostly handle really sensitive information, authentication and authorization information, then I do consider it under this category. The set cookie header instructs the client to save a cookie, which, as I just mentioned, usually contains sensitive data. This sensitive data can include session IDs or access tokens. And I strongly advise everyone to think twice if you actually need to, when you're thinking about caching data on the client side, please think twice to double check if you actually need to do that. The client side is inherently insecure because as developers, we're not able to control everything there. The set cookie header provides options to specify how the cookies should be stored, for how long, and certain transmission restrictions. You can, if you set a cookie to be deleted when the browser is closed, which is often the case, that's considered a session cookie. So you log into a website, you do whatever you need to do, you close the browser and the cookie is deleted. That's a session cookie. On the contrary, a persistent cookie is one that gets saved on the client side and persists until a specific point in time is reached. The more sensitive the data is that you're storing in the cookie, the sooner it should expire. This header helps prevent attacks such as session hijacking and cross-site request forgery or CSRF. Session hijacking happens when the attacker steals a cookie of another user possibly an admin, and then it can gain access to that user session. And a cross-site request forgery happens when, let's say, malicious website sends a request to a website that the victim user is already authenticated with. This way, the attacker can access functionality in the target website via the victim's browser with the authenticated session. The set cookie attributes, I think for this particular one, I'm listing all of them. As you can see, a lot of them have to do with security. That's why it's obvious to me that the set cookie header is this security header. When you say that the cookie should be secure, that's the first attribute right there. Then the cookie can only be sent using HTTPS. It can never travel in plain text HTTP. When you say it should be HTTP only, it prevents JavaScript from accessing the cookie. And this is very commonly used to prevent cookie stealing. That's again common when attackers are exploiting cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. The same site attribute can be set to strict or lax. If you set it to strict, then the cookie can only be sent to the original site. If you set it to lax, it also restricts the cookie to the original site, except when the user is following a link. I won't talk about too much details on the expires and max age directives, but they are basically used to specify time for how long a cookie should persist. And the domain and path are used to specify scope. The recommended configuration, it's shown right there. You should be pretty much using this configuration for all of your cookies, except the last attribute there, same site, which I think in most cases it should be strict, but you may have a legitimate use why you want to make it or you need to make it lax. A very interesting real-world example is one that didn't get as much attention, in my opinion, and it happened to Netflix in March of this year. So there was this researcher that reported this. I think he may have reported this through Backcrowd or HackerOne to Netflix, and they said some of the domains were not in scope or some things like that, which didn't really make too much sense, and especially given how critical this vulnerability was. And you can see the details in the link right there, but at a high level, the proof of concept exploit is using a classic man-in-the-middle attack to steal a session cookie. And the attack is possible because Netflix was continuing to use clear text HTTP connections on some of their subdomains, which is extremely surprising. And also, that particular cookie was not set with the secure attribute. Very, very basic things which were extremely surprising from a company like Netflix, which is known to have a pretty good security team and posture in general. Next, we're going to look at strict transport security. This actually would have prevented the vulnerability that I just mentioned. interestingly enough. So this particular header, sometimes known as HSTS for HTTP Strict Transport Security, tells the web client to access a website strictly over HTTPS and never using an insecure HTTP connection. It's important to note that you may, even if you set this header, you may be accessing the site over plain text HTTP the first time, but if this header is correctly set, you should never be accessing that site over plain text HTTP and should only be accessing it over secure HTTPS going forward. And this is because this configuration is triggering this mechanism on the client side and saving this configuration. If the expiration time is ever reached, which is very unlikely, if the header is correctly configured, the protection would no longer be in place. And it helps prevent, obviously, man-in-the-middle attacks, which in turn allows many other attacks, more commonly session hijacking. You just, exactly as this other example was showing, a man-in-the-middle attack, and then you completely take over another user's account by stealing the cookie. Some of the HSTS directives are for how the first one states for how long the browser should remember the configuration. Second one in there makes the configuration apply to all to the basic domain, but also all subdomains. And the third one is it's a little bit more tricky and needs careful configuration and testing. And it basically you have to submit a request for your domain through Google's HSTS preload service. And then if you successfully do that, you avoid that case that I mentioned earlier, in which the first time you access a site, it may be done over plain text HTTPS, because you are in Google's HSTS preload service. Then the browsers that use that server, which are most major browsers, will always access your site using HTTPS from the very beginning. The recommended configurations are shown down there in order of preference. If you are pretty confident about the testing and your configuration in general, you can submit your domain to Google's preload service, and then use the first configuration there, which is the most secure. Otherwise, you can use the second one, and it's still a pretty secure configuration. For the for a real world example, we have the Kaspersky Internet Security application, which is part of just their general security and antivirus suite of applications. The Internet Security one was ignoring this header. So this researcher on HackerOne found that you could man in the middle the connection. You could eavesdrop. Kaspersky installs a root certificate and takes over the validation, and that's how all these systems work. Because the recent version was ignoring this header altogether, it was made possible for users to override a certificate error with just a couple of clicks and put themselves at risk of man-in-the-middle attacks. So it was not completely transparent, but due to internet security from Kaspersky ignoring this particular security header, it would allow the user to go ahead and ignore the certificate error and potentially be attacked. Next, we're going to look at the XSS protection mechanism. So this mechanism is a little bit controversial, and we'll see why in a moment. It was created to improve the cross-site scripting defenses on the client side, which in this case were and are still. It's an cross-site scripting filter, or also called an auditor, special functionality on the web client side to try to help prevent these attacks. It's important to know that it's currently being removed by major browsers because it always had certain inherent issues that were never fully solved. And for example, Mozilla Firefox never believed in this mechanism and therefore never implemented it. And some of the issues that it had to do with preventing legit pages from loading, or attackers finding multiple ways again and again from bypassing this filter. So some of the tech giants have disabled this mechanism altogether a long time ago, and we'll see in a moment how you configure the header to disable the mechanism if that's what you would like to do. And it's important, very important to note that even if you keep it enabled under certain circumstances, this header is only a complement of many other XSS protection mechanisms you should have in your code. So here I'm making a recommendation based mostly on my personal understanding of this header and some recent research that I've done. And I'll be more than happy to discuss other opinions later on, most likely in the in the chat, because we won't have, I don't think we'll have any time for questions. So if you have a different opinion or questions around it, more than happy to chat with you later on the OWASP Slack channel. So what I personally recommend is keep this mechanism enabled if you're dealing with very old browsers that don't support content security policy, which is another very good security header that helps deal with XSS protection. If you have all the browsers that don't support CSP, or you don't have a good CSP, a good policy in place, or you think or know that your code doesn't really have any good XSS protection. If any of these three cases apply to you, I would personally suggest that you keep this mechanism enabled, because it's gonna be more good than bad. Now, if you don't need to support all browsers, and you know that you have a pretty decent CSP in place, or your code has good XSS protection, and that means good input filtering, based on what are good values expected, and coding data on output to prevent the browser interpreting malicious data as active content. So you can disable that mechanism if you're in the second case there. The directives are pretty simple: 0 for disabling, 1 for enabling, and then you can say enable and also block. If you only enable, the browser will try to sanitize the page, but that has a lot of other issues in itself, so it's not recommended. It's recommended that if you enable the mechanism, you go ahead and block the execution, which basically stops the page from even being shown on the browser. I couldn't really find any real-world examples, or recent examples at least, of this header protecting against vulnerabilities, or actually failing to protect against the vulnerability. But what I found is a really nice article with practical examples of XSS attacks, showing code and explaining how the browsers leverage their XSS filters or auditors to prevent those vulnerabilities, including screenshots and whatnot. So if you're interested in this subject, I strongly recommend you check out this article by Ned Sparker. Next one, we have the X content type options. Something I didn't mention for the previous header, which is X-XSS-Protection, is that the X prefix means this is a custom header. So it's not part of an official standard, but at the same time, all major browsers implement these headers. This header prevents the browser from sniffing an HTTP response and trying to guess its content type. And this in particular helps ensure that MIME types set by the application are respected by browsers, as opposed to trying to guess what content, what type of content it is. And some examples of MIME types, as I mentioned before, could be XML, JSON, or image files. The issue with sniffing the content is that it can lead to certain types of cross-site scripting attacks, and for sure increase unexpected application behavior due to incorrect guesses. If a server is returning files such as text or images, and the protection here is not used, the issue is that a browser could try to sniff the content and unexpectedly execute malicious code contained in those files. For example, the browser thinks it's a text file, but instead that text file contains HTML or JavaScript code, and then it gets executed unintentionally. It's important to note that this header should go along with the appropriate MIME type specified by using the content type header. The recommended configuration is very simple in this case, and it's actually the only one that exists. You just want to say, do not sniff content. Again, this should go along with the correct value for the type of content your application is serving in that particular instance. Some real-world examples of vulnerabilities that could have been prevented by the correct use of this header are the first one. It was this stored cross-site scripting vulnerability on a particular API for mapbox.com, which is a pretty popular mapping framework. So in this case, the attacker could store a cross-site scripting injection on their servers and exploit them using Internet Explorer, the Internet Explorer browser, due to JSON responses not disabling content sniffing. In the other example, which is pretty similar, it was also stored XSS, and in this case, the attacker would craft a malicious EML file that would trigger MIME type sniffing on the browser and lead to a stored XSS. And this is why I say this. Some of these headers are very easy to implement and big wins, big return of investment. If we look at how you implement this header, that's all you need to do. That one line, because hopefully you're already specifying the correct MIME types for the files you are serving. So you add that one extra line and you prevent vulnerabilities like these ones, which once again are pretty recent. The first one is from early this year. Next, let's look at the X-frame options header. So this header controls if and how a site may be loaded within an iframe. And an iframe, or also known as inline frame, is used to embed a document within another HTML document. Using iframes and not protecting them correctly usually ends up in allowing clickjacking attacks. And a clickjacking attack is when the attacker loads a page. The attacker can load another page in a transparent layer over the clickjacked page. So because this is the other page is loaded in a transparent layer, the user doesn't realize that when they're clicking on visible buttons or interacting with the application they are seeing, they're actually performing actions on the invisible page. So disabling iframe loading for your sites is a must, unless you know that that your site needs to be loaded within an iframe. This is a good mechanism to prevent many of these type of vulnerabilities, but it's worth noting that you should complement this with other clickjacking defense mechanisms, for example, content security policy or specific JavaScript code to help prevent this. This mechanism is being superseded by the Content Security Policy's Frame Ancestors Directive. But for older old browser compatibility, it's still recommended to implement both the Frame Ancestors Directive along with this header. The directives for this header are pretty simple. Basically, you disallow your site to be loaded within an iframe with the first one. With the second one, you can say that you can iframe this site, but only from within the same site. And the third one is just deprecated. Won't go into too many details. It's just replaced by frame ancestors from the content security policy, as I mentioned earlier. So the recommended configuration is obviously do not allow any site to iframe your site unless it's known and justified to do so. It may be the case that you need to iframe your own site. In that case, you want to use the second configuration listed there, which is same origin. Some real-world examples. First one is very recent, from February of this year. and it the lack of protection against clickjacking from not using this header or any other protection mechanism on this WordPress site was allowing an attacker to change the user account details, which usually means complete account takeover. The second one from Google, actually, some sensitive pages were missing this header or any other clickjacking protection mechanism, and therefore were susceptible to this kind of attack. And this was related to the payment functionality. So once again, another very easy to implement header. There's no reason not to do it. Referrer policy, it's an interesting one. It may get a little bit confusing. We only have a few minutes left. I have a lot more slides, so I'm going to have to wrap it up soon. But let's see if we can finish this one at least. So the referrer policy header controls how much referrer information should be included in HTTP request using the referrer header. Note that the referrer header has a typo in it, and that's how it was initially introduced in the early days, and it was just kept like that. It was never fixed. Now, also note that the referrer policy header is correctly spelled. It does not have that typo. So a referrer contains the address of the previous page from which a link to the currently requested page was followed. So basically, you're seeing page A in your browser, and you click a link to go to page B. When the browser sends a request to the server saying, "Hey, please give me page B," it's gonna include a referrer header that's gonna have the value of page A, the one where you were previously standing before going to page B. Legit uses for this referrer header include login and analytics, and other uses between quotes include information leaking and stealing. Let's look at a couple examples here. Let's say you have a password reset functionality from a site. So you start the process to reset your password, and you get a link which usually includes a secure token. You access that page, and then you access the page, and that page to reset your password has some social media links. You click on those links, and then the referrer header will send the full address of the page where you were sitting before to the social media site. So that information would include your your secure token. And of course, anyone seeing that information can completely take over your account by resetting your password. And the other example is something that's a very critical mistake in software development of web application, but still happens to this day, is including sensitive values as query parameters. This should sensitive values should never be included as query parameters for multiple reasons. They may be stored in the browser's history, They may be logged in, may be logged by web clients and web servers. And besides all of this, if you access a URL that contains sensitive values as parameters, and then you click to go to some other third-party link, all those sensitive values in that URL will also be sent to the third-party site. So you can see how this can go wrong really fast. I'm getting signal that unfortunately I'm out of time. Excuse me, I'm out of time. I do have a lot of more content in these slides, so I'm gonna be sharing the slides soon, and I hope you guys take a look at it, and we can chat some more about all these headers in the OWASP Slack. Happy to answer any questions or just provide the slides so you can have all the documentation. Next, we are going to have hour 11 coming up, and this is going to be hosted by Jason Sewell from the OWASP Hawaii chapter. So we're really going all over the place here. And remember that you need to go back to the YouTube channel and select the next link for hour 11. The stream will start at the top of the hour, so you have a few minutes for a short break. Thank you very much for your time. Apologies for not being able to finish this very long presentation. Again, I'm happy to chat some more in the OWASP Slack. Thank you for your time.